All right, welcome back everyone to the Madness and Grace podcast. We only have a few more episodes until 2024, which is just wild, Matt. I feel like the year flew by and we're wrapping up our first season. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it did seem to go a lot quicker, particularly since this was your idea, and I was kind of, well, we'll see. Nobody will listen to it, is what I said at the beginning. So, but we've had a lot of good listeners, and that's been great. And so, no, I've really enjoyed it. It's actually been a little, thanks to you, a lot easier than I imagined it would be to do all this. So we did have our ups and downs with trying to do it in a studio versus what people don't know is we record this just over Zoom. And that just makes it easier to record because we had a lot of problems with the studio. We couldn't get the microphones to work right.
A lot more work goes into a podcast than you think, but it's been really fun and I'm excited. We've got some good ideas for next year, some good guest ideas too. So yeah, all really exciting. And, we're wrapping up the end of the year and going over some different topics I wanted to talk about. The way I always research what we should talk about sounds silly, but I kind of see a lot of it on Instagram, a lot of it on TikTok, and kind of like, what's trending in the mental health sphere right now. And something that's new that people have been talking a lot about are, what role genetics play in mental health and kind of that nature versus nurture debate, which is, tale as old as time. People have talked about that forever. But specifically when it comes to mental health, I just think it's super interesting. And, I know that certain mental health disorders are more likely to be linked to genetics. And Matt, I was wondering if you have any certain ones that you could touch on or just kind of your knowledge on what role it plays in mental health.
Yeah, I think that, it's a real common question, because for instance, I think what really confuses a lot of people is the idea that, well, if there's a biological aspect to this disorder, how does sitting down with somebody and talking about it or talking about the symptoms or things like that, how can that make a difference? You can't really like talk yourself out of a heart condition or talk yourself out of liver cancer. So, but yeah, I think, I get asked that question all the time about, is it nature or nurture? Is it biology or environment? And it's both. And it's both in all disorders that exist. As you alluded to a minute ago, for some disorders, it's much more heavily biological. And for some disorders, it can be biological or environmental. So for instance, something like schizophrenia is heavily biological and has a very small environmental component, whereas something like depression could go either way. You could have, obviously you can be put into a situation of abuse, certain stressors that can bring about depression. You also can be born with the biological profile of somebody who is going to have more of a vulnerability for depression. I think what's important for people to realize is that, we use that term genetics all the time, or genetic, like your eye color is genetic. I mean, you got it from one of your parents. When we're talking about mental health problems or mental disorders, we're really talking about things that are multi-genomic. I mean, there's, it's going to take multiple genes, so you're talking about a massive gene profile and everything has to be just a certain way and then certain environmental factors that will cause that to manifest. So it's not as simple as, well, this one little gene that was passed on from my mom gave me this. It's multi-genomic. And I think the other thing that people have to understand is it's not as simple as, well, I'm born and I have this gene, and so that means I'm going to get this disorder. Because what happens is the genes cause they affect the way you perceive and sense and react to the environment. And then that affects how the environment responds to you. And so it then is this combination of and so if you could have that profile and be in a different set of circumstances and not manifest the illness. So it's always a combination of the two, not always equal. But and I think that's just kind of confusing for people because they want it to be kind of more simple, like, oh, well, I got this from my mom.
We recently did one of our educational programs on the neuroscience specifically behind addiction and how a lot of people are, more predisposed to becoming an addict than others just based on their genes and their family. That was very specific to addiction, but I'm wondering if there's a way, can you tell that, mental health issues are going to be an issue for someone before they're even born? Like, can mental health issues be predicted, just based off of genes?
Well, they can to only in the sense that we know that people that have these disorders, particularly certain disorders in their family, have a much higher risk of having those disorders themselves.
Hmm.
So, if somebody has a parent who has a mental disorder, then they are 5 times more likely than someone in the population to have a mental disorder than someone, I should say, they are more likely to have a mental disorder than someone in the population whose parents don't have a mental disorder. So they're 5 times more likely. So, one of the things we do when we're doing an intake of somebody is we would ask them things like, for your mother ever had any problems with mental health or addiction issues? Of your father, your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents? You want to kind of get those kind of first degree relative type stuff. And if you see mental health problems in there, then it's no shock that this person, but again, there's this weird interaction between the two. I mean, so
Yeah.
if the kid, if your father is an alcoholic and been involved in criminality and has antisocial personality disorder and ends up in prison, and then you start showing the same behaviors, well, is
Hmm.
that because you have the genes of that individual in you, or is it because that individual raised you? And
Right.
it's
Yeah.
the answer is probably both.
Hmm.
And so it's never as simple as, well, your dad had X, so that means you have it, because it's since it's multi-genomic, it's much more complicated than that. As far as prediction goes, I mean, that is something that's, they're constantly working on trying to see if we can come up with a profile, because you can predict certain genetic disorders, not mental
Right.
disorders, but and those tend to be pretty specific. But there is a lot of work going on. I mean, that is the hope, that they could do, in a sense, a genetic screen and tell you. I think more likely than not, what they can tell you is they can give you a probability that you might show this, or a probability that you might show that. It's much more like cancer. If you have
Yeah.
cancer in your family, you're more likely to have cancer yourself. And so they can give you a sense of kind of that you have a greater or a greater vulnerability to cancer. I think we can kind of get to the same thing with depression. You could have or schizophrenia or whatever, you can have a greater vulnerability, but whether they could ever predict it, that's a tough one.
I'm curious to know, I mentioned before we started the podcast that addiction runs in my family pretty deep. And I myself have kind of, as a young adult, started to kind of do the work to make sure that, do my best to make sure that I don't fall into addiction myself, because I know I'm more predisposed to it due to my genetics. And what are some things, I know what I do, I try to, develop a healthy relationship to alcohol, try to develop, kind of notice addictive traits in myself and, tackle those head on. But what can someone who has mental illness in their family do to kind of, the word prepare isn't right. Oh, I have a mother who was clinically depressed, or maybe you have suicide in your family, or, what can someone do to kind of prep themselves for what they're genetically disposed to, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I think that, if you've got depression is a good example. I mean, what if you have
Yeah.
depression that runs in your family? Your mother was depressed and she said that your grandmother was depressed, and you've got an aunt who struggled with depression. Well, I mean, if you've got that, there are things you can do. Obviously, you can first start with the simple things like your physical health. You can
Hmm.
make sure that you're eating right and you're exercising. Those things do play a role.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You can prepare one of the problems with depression is that, you can go into a really dark place very quickly when circumstances, aren't so good. And so you can make sure that you have friends around you and support systems around you that are aware of your concern about depression and what's been in your family, and that they're there for you to talk to
Hmm.
when you're struggling, and that they've been given permission to share with you, like, hey, I've been noticing this in you, like you really been starting to isolate yourself. And then also, I think, why would you not go and build a relationship with a counselor or a therapist and
Hmm.
say, I'm here right now because my mother and my grandmother and my aunt or whoever has struggled horribly with depression, and I can see those tendencies in myself, and I
Hmm.
want to make sure that I have educated outside third party that can give me feedback to say, okay, well, you're moving in this direction, or here's some skills to help you deal with that negative kind of thinking, and
Mhm.
help prepare you, and help and really kind of, again, I would, like you said, I wouldn't say depression proof you, but make it easier for you to recognize when something like that's going to happen, or to give you skills to help you navigate that more easily. So, it may sound strange when we're talking about that from a perspective of depression, but if I were, if you told me that your mother had breast cancer and your grandmother had breast cancer and your aunt had breast cancer,
Mhm.
literally, they would do some genetic screens to get some feel for your vulnerability, but they also would tell you to have certain diets and to be exercising and get regular checkups and all these kind of things. I mean, there's actually, I won't mention her name, but there's actually a very famous actress whose breast cancer has run so heavily in her family that she actually had a double mastectomy before
Wow.
she ever showed any signs of breast cancer, because
Mhm.
she was virtually positive, because she had the genetic predisposition that she was going to get it and she wasn't going to die young. So,
Yeah.
I mean, people can go to great extremes. So I think, people do that all the time with physical illnesses, particularly cancer. I don't know why we don't do it with mental health things. We tend to like to go and deny those. And I think
Mhm.
you can do the same thing with substance use. I think, like you said, you have to, the first thing is awareness and recognition. You can't just
Mhm.
say, well, that was my mom.
Yeah,
She drank
I'm
too
me.
much.
Mhm.
Right. Well, that mom raised you and
Mhm.
taught you all her bad habits, just like we
Mhm.
all do. But,
Mhm.
and then she also gave you her genetics. And so, you're already a little behind the eight ball. But if you
Mhm.
know that, well, then you can absolutely. I mean, my father, alcoholism runs in my family. My father, watched his father drink. He had to go into bars and pull him out. He saw those kind of things happen. And he basically decided that he would just never drink, that
Yeah.
that was something that we not do. And so
Yeah.
that's the way he kind of stepped into that. But, I think if you know where you are, you can do things about it.
And I think everyone's journey with that looks a lot different. Like I said, the way I'm coping with it is okay, let me try and develop a healthy relationship
Right.
with
Yeah.
alcohol. Now, for some people, that would be, I just know I'm so genetically predisposed. I'm never going to touch it. You make that oath to yourself. So I think everyone's journey is different. And I like what you said about, comparing it to a physical illness. If you're predisposed to cancer, you're going to go in for regular checkups. You're not going to wait until you're on your deathbed with breast cancer to seek help. So, same thing goes for depression or addiction. It's a privilege to have mental health care, but if you can do it, treat it like a regular checkup. Find someone to
Right.
talk to and treat it like a regular checkup, and know that you could be heading down that genetic path if, you don't do the work yourself.
We so commonly go to doctors when we are to a physician when we are healthy, for
Mm-hmm.
a well check and things like that. People never even think about that when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to mental health. So,
Yeah.
really what you're saying is take an inventory, look at the weaknesses that you have. Do you have, unhealthy eating when you get emotional? Do you drink too much alcohol when you're in a bad situation? I mean, we all have bad coping skills. We all do, take an inventory and then go
Mhm.
talk to somebody about it.
We already kind of touched on, what the future might look like, based on predicting and again, being predisposed to mental illness. But do you know if there are any, new sort of treatment options that could be based on this? What have you heard that's kind of floating around out there?
Well, I think one of the more exciting things that's happening that is really becoming more common is kind of some pharmacogenetics, where, well, basically what more and more physicians or psychiatrists particularly are
Hmm.
making available to their clients, where they'll take a swab of the inside of their cheek, get some skin cells, and send that off, and then they're able to look at the genes of the individual, and they have a good feeling for, well, with if you've got, for instance, your body doesn't make this enzyme, you can tell that
Hmm.
from your genes. Well, that means that these three antidepressants aren't going to work for you because you need
Hmm.
that enzyme. Or
Yeah.
well, you make this enzyme, which means it breaks down this antidepressant, so there's no reason for you to take that. So it actually can give the doctor really a head start on knowing what medications are going to be more likely to help you versus those that are less likely to help you. And it really could save, frankly, years by getting you closer to the kind of right medication from the beginning. Because I mean, right now, a lot of times you see numbers like, a 2.5 year trial and error before people feel like they have the right mix of medications and stuff. And so with the pharmacogenetics, I mean, that's pretty exciting stuff. They're not predicting, a mental disorder, but they're able to say, well, this medication is going to be helpful. And I think ultimately what that's going to lead us to is, and this is what most people think, it's kind of designer medications. And so you
Hmm.
go in, they take a swab, they run your genetics, and you're there for, whatever, depression. And then what they'll be able to do is they'll be able to make an antidepressant that is specific for your genetic makeup. So it works. This is the medication for depression that will work best for you.
Wow,
It
that's
won't,
cool.
it probably wouldn't work for any other person because these are your genes, but and literally they will make it specific. It's a designer drug just for you. And
Hmm.
then you get a lot of specificity in treatment. But again, not to say, that therapy is bad. I mean, therapy
Yeah.
is highly effective for particularly depression and anxiety disorders. And what you find is when you scan people, say fMRI, before they go through therapy, during and after, you actually find biological changes in their brain as a result of that. All you're doing is you're activating or developing new pathways
Hmm.
when you are, coming up with these new skills and things like that. So really, that's a biological treatment in its own right. It just takes longer.
Well, that's exciting. That's really cool. As a person who doesn't know the super scientific side of that, that's really cool. And also as a person who has tried different anti-anxiety medicines and ones that didn't work for me, and then now I'm on one that works for me, I could have saved that time.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. And it is
yeah,
very much trial and error, because two people will come in, they can be the same age, the same gender, everything,
right.
have exactly the same symptoms. You give them both the same medication, and it's a miracle for one person, it doesn't do anything for the other.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. Hopefully those listening can relate to me that, you're not the scientific one in this conversation, but I feel like everyone listening has learned a lot, and obviously nature versus nurture will probably continue as the
It's
age-old
both.
debate. But when really it's both. Okay, well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you everyone for listening. Of course, I want to plug the Hope and Healing Center because we have so many great free available resources, lots of different things, whether you're looking to just learn more about different disorders, we have education programs, or if you need to talk to somebody right away, our Hope line is available from 5 to 8 p.m. for free peer counseling over the phone. And we can't recommend that resource enough. So thank you everyone for listening. And thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you, Emily.